Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Rapici, we're here again.
Dr. Falk, indeed we are. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I'm eager to talk about Walter Benjamin's The Storyteller. Yeah. And I guess I'm going to set a little bit of do a little front loading, but then I'm going to pass it on to my able partner to take us directly into the essay. I'm just going to do this bit of front loading. First off, we had mentioned, because I don't know if it was mentioned explicitly in the Byung-Chul Han piece in the New Yorker, the feature piece on Byung-Chul Han that we discussed in the last episode. I don't know if this was explicitly brought up, and I think Benjamin was name checked. And if not, we realized that Benjamin was one of the big influences of Byung-Chul Han very clearly. And we said that, a lot of what Byung-Chul Han is about has to do with some key Benjaminian themes. And Han is explicit about it. The key Benjaminian themes of the difference between stories and information, the different ways in which modes of storytelling reflect understandings of time and periodization. So some of these key themes that Byung-Chul Han has sort of recovered were there in Walter Benjamin's essay from the, I believe, 1920s or early 30s called The Storyteller. So we promised that we would next time talk about The Storyteller. And I think I have to say one other thing, just to establish continuity with the last episode, but also to give our dear audience a sense of where we're going. We're delivering. This is going to be an episode that talks more specifically about Walter Benjamin's essay, The Storyteller, pretty much to the exclusion of talking about Byung-Chul Han. But we plan to do another episode that's going to explicitly tie some of the ideas about narrative and storytelling and information and social media, along with the ideas that we're discussing in response to Benjamin's essay, The Storyteller, in this particular podcast episode. Anything else to say on that, or?
No, I think this is basically, as we had discussed before we started recording, this is a sort of an incredibly deep discussion that Benjamin is having here. And to try and do everything at once would take far more time than would be ideal for us, and probably much longer than most of you listening would want to, sit through in one shot. So rather than trying to cover everything or trying to condense it into one episode, I think at the cost of, a legitimate discussion of the ideas here, this episode is really just going to focus on sort of the groundwork. What are the sort of major
Benjaminian themes, right?
Yeah. And then the second installment of this, I think is an opportunity to really connect what is Benjamin talking about, what was Han talking about when he was talking about Benjamin, really even beyond those two, how it connects a lot of the other thinkers that we've been discussing, for the past.
And their discussion of time and boredom and how to spend time and things like this.
Boredom was the big one that jumped out to me, because it's such an incredibly, I think, consistent and important theme across so many thinkers. And it really stands as this concept, which is, in modern media, increasingly absent. So the fact that it shows up in such stark relief here, and it's such a central theme for Han and Stiegler and others, that I think that warrants its own episode. So
now you mention it, I'm going to dare say that I'm going to remind our listeners, but also ourselves, of the general trend of this kind of season in critical media studies. We've been thinking about how media affects our everyday lives, right? Thinking about everyday existential issues that are raised by our consumption of social media, and technology. So that's very much Han's concern, right? Han, as we talked about in the last episode, is raising existential themes and existential questions, kind of recovering these existential questions, questions about being, and relating them to modern technologies, especially the modern technology of social media. And I think that's very much, and trying to make sense of, using a very broad word, but I think a helpful keyword, trying to make sense of our experience with media, our everyday experiences with media. And that's the real tie-in between Hahn and so many of the thinkers we talk about, and especially Mr. Walter Benjamin in the Storyteller essay that we're going to discuss now. One last bit of groundwork. I forgot to mention this. We're going to talk about the storyteller in regard to social media. And I think Michael and I are in clear agreement, strong agreement, that this essay, although written early in the 20th century and published early in the 20th century, is full of really important reflections on humans and technology, humans and media technology. And I noted to my surprise, and I brought it to Michael's attention, there is a Harvard book. Harvard has been responsible for republishing a lot of Benjamin's stuff in the last 10 years. I guess now a little bit more than 10 years. Time flies when you're having a Benjaminian riot. The Belknap Press of Harvard University Press published in 2008 a 400, no, almost a 500-page collection of essays entitled "The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility and Other Writings" by Walter Benjamin on media. I went to go find, I pulled out this volume in order to see, I said, surely the Storyteller essay is available in that volume as much. I'm reading the Storyteller essay, and maybe this is your text as well, Michael, or the PDF came from this text of from the original translation in America, in English rather, in American. Thank you. Thank you, Barry Imperialist. In the original translation by Harry Zahn that was brought out by Schocken Books with an introduction by Hannah Arendt, the Illuminations volume. But I was thinking, okay, here's a nifty new translation in the Harvard University Press Imprimatur. Comes out in 2008. Surely the Storyteller essay is in there. It's not. So maybe that's another little contribution of critical media studies we'd like to think to discourse on Benjamin, because as we read this essay, and I think we would have felt this even if we weren't primed by Byung-Chul Han, this is a media theory essay. It's it's proto-McLuhan as much as Marshall McLuhan, and of course before Marshall McLuhan. This is a proto-media studies theory essay.
You know, I have a question for you. As you were talking about that, the one thing, because since you noted its absence in that edition, I'm wondering, do you think that its omission has something to do, and this could be our segue into beginning the actual discussion here. Do you think maybe its omission has something to do with the
Too
fact
literary?
that,
Too
well,
much literature?
no, I'm thinking more, when you think of media, right? Storytelling is an oral tradition, and it is a form of communication that is not imbued technologically. And I'm wondering if maybe that's where the line for its inclusion or omission is drawn.
I think you're right, but
But
I
it's an it's it's an
tremble.
it's an
But I
oversight.
tremble because
Yeah.
I tremble at that possibility, because if you actually read the essay,
Oh,
that's the premise. The premise
yes.
of this is that one form of non-technological, so to
Mhm.
speak. I mean, that's a technology too. I think Benjamin would say storytelling is a technology, but it is not an industrial technology. It
Right.
is not a technology of mass reproduction. But that's precisely that distinction, and the importance of the distinction is what the FNSA is about.
Careful, careful.
I'm
No,
keeping
I
this
I'm
friendly for everyone, but it's what the essay is about. So I mean, that's why I was saying I'm trembling. I mean, that probably is the reason, Michael. But then if you go into the essay,
Yeah, no,
what
it's
you
it's
have
it's
is a profound reflection on the differences between non-technological narratives and technologically empowered
it
narratives.
is a
Right?
miss to be sure. I'm just trying to see if I
Yeah,
can
no,
put my
you're probably
finger
right.
on.
You're probably right. But you set yourself up here, and I'm getting to get out of your way because you produced the radio segue
There we go.
that will allow us to allow you specifically to talk about, introduce the major themes of the essay.
Well, I think not so much necessarily introduce the themes, but sort of give us a foothold to start the discussion, right? And so the essay is called The Storyteller. And in trying to figure out how to arrange our discussion, we thought it best that we might begin with a short discussion of what exactly, or who exactly, or what exactly the storyteller is. And so to read briefly, just to set the table here, Benjamin begins the essay by saying, familiar though his name may be to us, the storyteller in his living immediacy is by no means a present force. He has already become something remote from us, and something is getting even more distant. And then he jumps down and he says, the art of storytelling is coming to an end. Less and less frequently do we encounter people with the ability to tell a tale properly. More and more, there's an embarrassment all around when the wish to hear a story is expressed. It is as if something that seemed inalienable to us, the securest among our possessions, were taken from us, the ability to exchange experiences. And so, the first, I think, question that we probably need to dig into is what exactly is storytelling, or more to the point, maybe what isn't storytelling? And
And in part of the, I take it what you're going to do now is talk about, is you're going to invoke what he presents as the counter to the
yes,
storytelling, which is the novel.
right.
So,
So, and that becomes, and I think for our discussion today, that's a large part of the distinction here is there is a difference between the story and the novel. And so, it's maybe easiest to start with the novel. As Benjamin understands the novel, it is a self-contained tale, right? That has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is
and that it's produced,
it is enabled.
packaged,
Yes,
consumed uh, on the individual level by an individual.
right.
And there are very certain, because it is an object that is mass produced
Hmm.
and there is a potential for any book to become a mass media, mass audience, to reach a mass audience. Because of that, there are certain determinate limits. The form, McLuhan-esque, right?
Hmm.
In McLuhan fashion, the form of the novel dictates certain limits, certain content, certain themes, and certain ideas. The storytelling, the storyteller and the story and storytelling do not work within the confines of the novel.
No,
That's one about
yeah,
it.
the novel, I think, at every stage is really a solitary event. Um, whereas
And that's
the
the big word he uses. He uses that word solitary,
right,
individual, individuating, when
right.
he talks about the difference between narrative in novel forms and narrative, way of it that individuals or groups experience the overhearing, the telling of a story.
Mhm. The other hand, the story, right, is this communal experience.
Indeed.
Um, that is different in the sense that while it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, there is a pre-story and there is the post-story. These have the ability to expand or contract as
Right.
necessary.
And
Um,
that's the crucial point, that stories, unlike the novel, which ends on the final page, and we know even before we read it, if we peek to the end and we see, oh, the end, this novel, the final page of this novel is page 250, then we know as we get closer to 250,
the end is near, and
the
then the
end
end is
is
here.
near.
Right.
As opposed to the story, as we'll talk about this more as we continue moving through the essay. But one of the key things to understand about the storytelling is that storytelling also is finite, but it is not so clearly demarcated. At any point, if the social circumstances allow, the story can be expanded, augmented, and potentially, at least, storytelling, narration of a story as opposed to a novel, is interminable, is without end.
Right. So that's, I think, the major distinction between the novel and the story. And so I really, to me, as I read this, what he's talking about across this essay is sort of the nature of interpersonal communication
Mhm.
that we get in storytelling, which
And
is
only in storytelling.
right. And yes, so he's that, and I think the significance of this is really tethered to this idea of what the content of a story versus a novel enables or prompts or encourages us to do, or how we process this. Um, and he talks a bit, and we'll get into this shortly, about the difference between information, right, which you get again not just through the novel but also through newspapers, versus the story, which has a less open and closed um, interpretation or meaning, I
Absolutely.
guess we
Right,
could
right,
say.
right. And you put that well.
Yeah. So that's the table setting, I think, for this.
Well, why don't we, now that we set everything up, why don't we immediately go into very, very deep waters? That second paragraph, I think, is an abyss, but I use abyss in a good way. Can you do that? Can you say abyss in a good way and use it in a good way? In that, I think this is one of the richest passages in the essay, and that's saying a lot in
Yeah.
this particular essay because it raises so many ideas. And in this paragraph, I think it becomes explicit, getting to our returning to an earlier point we made. I think in this paragraph, uh, uh, the essay announces itself as a media studies essay because part of the transition, part of the differences between the storytelling, the story, the storyteller, and the new modern experience of technology. Um, Part of the difference is it has to do with the changing narratives, the changing experience, or the changing development, rather, evolutions, has to do with the evolution of technology. And he makes this very important, including the evolution of modern warfare. So
Yeah.
there's just a
Yeah.
lot of deep stuff that comes up in this next paragraph. So I'm going to read it.
Let's get into it.
Well, without any further ado, let's jump off the cliff and go into the deep passage that is the second paragraph in section 1 of the essay, where Benjamin gestures to these larger social structures, really kind of cataclysmic historical events that have initiated this transition, or have concretized the shift from storytelling to novel reading. Yeah, Michael, you seem like you wanted to say
Well,
something.
yeah, just briefly, I don't know. I'm going to push back a little bit. I don't know that these are necessary. I think he uses large events, but I think his point is
Mhm,
not so much, and I think this is important, that it takes
mhm,
a cataclysmic social event
mhm,
to move the needle. I think that what he's looking at
mhm,
here, and this gets us again to the printing press and just sort of the technological evolution. One
mhm,
of my
mhm,
takes in terms of the overall
mhm,
thrust of the argument here
mhm.
is that this isn't a case of radio killed the radio, or radio killed the videos, video killed the radio star. My God, I totally hammered that up. So
The
much
radio may have killed the video star,
they
but
have, right, so much as it's a case that technology is going to consistently enable certain things, books, newspapers, mass media, right? But in doing so, it's going to shift the way that other means of communication exist and potentially kill them off. So I don't know that it takes a
hmm,
cataclysmic moment to do this. I think this is just sort of the
hmm,
sands of time
Hmm.
But I also don't think he's saying that the storyteller is dead. I just
Hmm.
think that this is a case of storytelling no longer occupying
Hmm.
primacy, largely because we have other bigger, more um, efficient means of communicating stuff. And as that stuff gets communicated, as he argues here, I think the
Hmm.
nature and depth of what
Hmm.
is communicated, the pool gets a little shallower.
Hmm. I would take issue with that, but
Let's see.
I'm not going to do it for the. I want to do it after I read it because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think what he's gesturing to, and this to well, I'll say this before I read the passage, but I will read the effing passage because we need to get to it. But I think what I admire about the second, I mean, I take everything you said. Certainly, that you just well described the movement of the essay.
Hmm.
I mean, it is through changes, large and small, that the novel has evolved to become to represent this kind of different commodity, this different experience, this less personal mode of communication. So you're right, absolutely right, and this is what I think you perfectly described the larger, arc of the essay, which is to say, large and small, there have been all these historical factors that have produced the conditions that Benjamin and his generation are dealing with. That said, one of the pathos of this paragraph for me, considering the fact that it's written pretty soon, relatively soon after World War One, I think this paragraph, he kind of breaks form.
It's
He kind of
36, by the
says,
way.
in World War One, though, we had the spectacle, history was interrupted by the experience of mass murder, of
Mhm.
mass death. And that has accelerated the process. So I mean, that's the only reason I'm pushing back. You're
Yeah,
right I think that's a brilliant description of the arc of the essay. But in the second paragraph, it's why I find it so moving. It's like Benjamin is saying, we just went through something
no,
relatively
that's fair.
recently.
Well, I guess my point was just that if the asteroid killed the dinosaurs, right, or led to the chain of events that kills dinosaurs, if we don't have that asteroid, maybe we still have dinosaurs. I
Oh,
think
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
point the
Right,
point
right,
here
right.
is it doesn't take an asteroid to change these. That's all I meant by that. But
Let me read
yes,
the passage.
gosh,
Let me read the passage.
go.
Uh, One reason for this phenomenon, this transition, is obvious. Experience. Okay, that's a key word. That's why we want to read
Hmm.
this passage. I'll continue reading. Experience in the modern world has fallen in value, and it looks as if it is continuing to fall into bottomlessness. Here's the media part of it. The newspapers are introduced as a technology that is slowly but inexorably part of this change as well. Every glance at a newspaper demonstrates that it has reached a new low, that our picture, not only of the external world, but of the moral world as well, overnight has undergone changes which were never thought possible. With the First World War, a process began to become apparent, which has not halted since. Now, actually, that sentence is kind of supporting both our claims. With the First World War, a process began to become apparent, which has not halted since then. But, I mean, what's the implication of that? The process predates the First World War.
Right.
The First World War, the cataclysm of the First World War, has just made it more apparent what is going on. But the inexorable social change was already predates the war. So we're both right, in that sentence. That sentence suggests we're both right in our reading of the general tenor of the essay. Was it not noticeable at the end of the war? This is the poignant part.
Hmm.
Was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown silent, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience? That word again. What 10 years later was poured out in the flood of war books was anything but experience that goes from mouth to mouth. Fascinating, right? These war books are war memorials. They're memorials to experience. They're attempts to narrate experience, but they're not stories.
Right.
The authors were not able to process them into the stories that Benjamin recognizes as key to this writer, Nicholas Leskov, from the Russian tradition, that he feels is this 19th century Russian who's very in touch with this, with really an oral, even though he's writing stories and publishing stories. Leskov for Benjamin is having a residue, is carrying over an older kind of storytelling in the new media form. All right. What 10 years later was poured out in the floor, I read that. And there was nothing remarkable about that, for never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly than strategic experience by tactical warfare, economic experience by the modern experience. He's talking about Germany, the Weimar Republic, right?
Right.
This
That's right.
very timely. Economic experience by the experience of inflation, bodily experience by mechanical warfare. All these are media changes, media technological
Absolutely.
changes, right?
Absolutely.
Moral experience by those in power. A generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds, and beneath those clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. That's where the paragraph ends, but let me add a couple words.
Sure.
Was the tiny, fragile human body. Now, here are the words I want to add to this that I think are implied. It's a tiny, fragile, it's always been a tiny, fragile human body at stake or in action in the face of these larger historical forces, let alone the historical force of technological change. But the difference is the tiny, fragile human body was able to interact with other tiny human fragile bodies through the medium of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to process their experience of being dwarfed by all these larger structures. They were able to translate it into human terms. That's what these tiny, fragile human bodies have lost.
Now, I have a question for you about this, because in discussing this through with you, I'm coming back to my statement earlier. Obviously, the war is the impetus for this change, for these changes, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And as it's written here, there's a way of looking at this that say, well, the men that return from the battlefield are not communicating these things. They're not taught, they're not sharing stories about this. That what we have now in these books is more of a historical rendering of the events that took place, perhaps,
Yeah.
than the
Interesting.
actual
Interesting.
exchange of experience. And so in a way, it's almost, there's a way of reading this that says, okay, well, these men come back sort of shocked into silence, and that the change that we have in terms of our orientation to the world, which is foreclosing upon the sort of interpersonal experience, is all precipitated by war. And I look at this and I say, okay, that's fine. We look at this. I think this essay was written in 1936. He's obviously
much later than I thought. I'm sorry.
right. No, it's fine.
Okay.
But the war would certainly be this giant historical marker. It's a,
Of course,
it's
of
a
course,
great place
of
to
course,
start this discussion.
of
But
course.
what I had said earlier, and I don't think I necessarily want to backtrack on it, but I want your thoughts on this. There's always going to be some sort of disruption that any new technology is going to disrupt the whatever the current state of
Oh yeah,
existence
yeah,
is.
yeah.
And so, do you think that absent a war, these changes in experience and these changes in the way that we are able to communicate our experiences still take place?
I think I drew attention to this when I was reading it, and I'll return to it because I think that one sentence, I think the answer to that question, according to Benjamin, answer to your question is a strong yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's implied in that one sentence that I read that I hadn't noticed until I read it. But once I read that sentence, he is making the kind of devil gesture that we want him to make. And that would mean that the answer to your question is yes. There is something, the World War I accelerates a process of inexorable change that predates by a couple centuries World War I. He says it explicitly in this sentence. With the First World War, a process began to become apparent, which has not halted since then. But I think the implication, the clear implication is process began to become apparent, but not that the process started with
No.
World
So
War
here's the question then. Is it then that these new technologies shift our focus away from whatever it was before and onto whatever the new technology is advancing, and therefore change the nature of the way that we communicate? Because what you have here with, with the in terms of the novel, for example, right?
right?
Then, as he says, the novel is dependent on the form, it's dependent on the book, which is dependent upon the printing press, right?
Mhm,
Which
mhm,
does not require the storyteller to be
mhm,
present. This is now
mhm,
becoming an isolated thing.
mhm,
So, is it just a case of sort of directing our attention in whatever way a
mm,
new or dominant technology works, and therefore away from whatever was the previous standard?
mm.
I mean, I'm not trying to make this a shell game, but at the same time, I
Well,
think,
maybe I'm not sure. I mean, I think the obvious answer is yes, if you're saying that one of the consequences, but maybe
yeah.
I'm wondering whether or not this is your question. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. I think your question is this new awareness or this new consciousness of the nullity of experience, is
Well,
that an effect of the war? Or is that one of the consequences of the war? But I sense that's not really your
no, no,
question.
no, no.
So
I,
maybe
I
I
think
don't get
I
you.
think that we're clear on the fact that the war is the
Uh-huh.
the starting point for his discussion here. But
Yeah.
he makes a
Yeah.
note that says, hey, these were things that were taking place before the war.
Yeah.
But he's saying earlier, right, that we're losing the ability to tell a tale properly.
Right. Right.
And so there's a couple ways of looking at sort of why
Hmm.
this is the case. And it seems
Hmm.
to me that his argument here is that essentially our storytelling ability, our storytelling muscles are atrophied
Indeed. Indeed. Indeed.
because
Indeed.
new technologies that print, the novel, right?
Oh, okay. I think I'm grasping your question. You're thinking that in a way, before World War, what's happened? I think I'm beginning to see the light here, and I like your argument a lot. If I'm getting it, tell me. Um, you're saying that what World War One really clarifies is the fact that our muscles were already unable to process the new transformation. They had already atrophied by the time of the First World War. Does that make sense?
Well, that they
Am I
were
getting it? Am I
we were
capturing it? No.
yeah, I think so.
I
That
think he is saying that there has been a long that the what World War One clarifies is is the case that our muscles, our storytelling muscles, were already weak and anemic and on the verge of, they couldn't bear that much anyway, let alone the experience of World War One. I
yes.
like that. I like that
Okay.
idea a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he is saying that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I struggle a little bit with that,
Well,
but
I'm no, I think that's more on me than you. I'm
no, but I think it's a great. I mean, I think it's okay. In the let me try to pull a let me try to pull a gem out of before we go to our final
Yep.
uh, um, uh, nugget from the story the storyteller that we were trying to explicate. Let me see if I can pull something out of the jaws of defeat there. I think our discussion, our conversation has highlighted something really kind of important about the essay in general, that Benjamin is talking about maybe yes, we're claiming this essay for media studies, right? But I think what our conversation and what we were trying to clarify in that paragraph really shows us is it shows something about the complexity or the ambition of Benjamin's essay. He's working with he's thinking about processes that interact in very complex ways. And so there are a couple of stories he's telling here. The story of the evolution of technology, the story of the evolution of modern warfare, the story of the evolution of modern modes of production. And all these stories are connected. And part of the difficulty of the essay is, he expects the reader to sort of untangle all these things as they make their way through the essay. Does that sound fair? So, I mean, this is a challenge of the essay, but it's a bracing challenge. It's a good thing of the essay. It's a very complex notion of history. And I would say that one last thing on this. Now you reminded me of how late this essay is. One of the things I was struck about this essay is that he's thinking about history, but he's not necessarily thinking, at this point, I would think that he's thinking about Marx and taking Marxist categories and modes of thinking very seriously. But this essay is kind of light on the Marxism, i.e., the idea of class struggle is not, the history of class struggle is not the central history of this particular essay.
But does that, I think it's because
it is on the edge. Now, if you're going to say, is it on the edges? Yes, it is. But my point is that I was trying to make the larger point that I think we've been making, that he has a very complex notion of history here. And the historical changes he's talking about, they're not unilinear. They interact in several different ways. So usually, the criticism that is often leveled against Marxist histories is that they're overemphasizing the history of class struggle. He certainly doesn't do that here.
No.
It's a very complex notion of history.
Yes. Shall we jump to section 7?
Sure, but did you have something you wanted to say there, or wanted to?
No, it's just going to take us down a rabbit hole. And
okay. Well, let's try to bring the plane in for a landing and talk about section 7, where Benjamin provides a very useful example of the difference of how a story differs from the stories that are presented in novel form.
Right. And I think that's basically the sort of the
so let's do it.
We're working in here, right? The story as opposed to the novel.
We're trying to talk about the main distinction of the essay in preparation for Byung-Chul Han episode, right?
Yeah.
Where we're going to bring it back to Han, but right now we're thinking about differences between novels and stories and what they say about experience. Maybe we can think of that as we wrap things up, Michael. Like maybe we can return to that concept of experience here and see how that fits into his definition of story.
Oh, I think very much.
Okay.
I think very much here.
So I'll read, and I'm going to make, oh man, I should have looked up how to pronounce these names, but I'm just going to butcher the names, okay? I'm going to butcher the Egyptian and the Persian name, and you just write my congressman and complain. Okay. When the Egyptian king, so in order to give an example of a story, Benjamin gives us a story that he takes from the Greek historian Herodotus. It is as follows. When the Egyptian king Samanidas had been beaten and captured by the Persian king Cambyses, Cambyses was bent on humbling his prisoner. He gave orders to place the Egyptian king on the road along which the Persian triumphal procession was to pass. And he further arranged that the prisoner should see his daughter pass by as a maid going to the well with her pitcher. While all the Egyptians were lamenting and bewailing this spectacle, the Egyptian king stood alone, was mute. Later, he sees his son. who was being taken along in the procession to be executed. He likewise remained immoved. But when afterwards he recognized one of his servants, an old impoverished man, in the ranks of the prisoners, all of a sudden he beats his fists against his head and he beat his fists against his head and gave all the signs of deepest mourning. So that's the story. And then here's Benjamin's gloss on why this story from Herodotus is a perfect example, even though it's in a written chronicle.
Yes.
It's a perfect example of how stories work. And here, Herodotus is a storyteller more than a historian, the father of historiography. Later on in the essay, he talks about, we're not going to have time to talk about it, but later on, he talks about historiography as a kind of mode of storytelling. So this also kind of sets up a later discussion. But anyway, let's go to his gloss on it, Benjamin's gloss. From this story, it may be seen what the nature of true storytelling is. The value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives, okay, so
this
information is modernity, right? Information is the modern, information is the world of the novel, it's the world of modernity.
Right.
Right?
And this to me is his argument, or at least this portion of his argument,
Absolutely.
as clearly expressed as it comes.
Do you want to read it? We want to read these
Go
next couple
ahead.
sentences? The value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives only at that moment. A story is different. It does not expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength and is capable of releasing it even after a long time. Now, I won't read the rest of the paragraph. I'm going to throw it to Dr. Rapici, but I'll just say I'm going to summarize the rest of the paragraph. In the rest of the paragraph, Benjamin notes that so thousands of years, 1,000 years after Herodotus, the French philosopher, essayist, whatever he was, category he was, Michel de Montaigne, returns to Herodotus' story, retells it, and gives one interpretation. But but what Benjamin shows is Montaigne's interpretation is just one interpretation. The story is not exhausted, and this is a characteristic of the story. It is not exhausted by a single interpretation, no matter how gifted the interpretation. Stories are always perennial event. They are inexhaustible. Information exhausts itself in the moment of its telling.
Yeah.
Storytelling does not.
And I think that's it. I mean, I don't know that I really have a whole lot to add. I think that the distinction between and I like that you use the term modernity. I think that's a much better term than trying to put the story, opposite the novel here, right? But this idea that information is useful in that moment, and that as soon as that moment is gone, the value is gone. And I think that this speaks towards the disposable nature of information.
Yeah.
And so the question comes down to
or data, to use the word that we'll use next
where
episode,
we're going
right?
with it. Yeah. So but it's interesting because this sort of speaks towards the way that meaning gets produced, right? There is an effort, there's action required, a mutual engagement in storytelling, where you, the storyteller, are going to provide me a context and a series of moments. But in order for something to become of that, there's an interpretation which is not static, which is not definite, right? There is an uncertainty to that, which really flies in the face of the rapidity which we prize so much.
Wonderful.
In information.
That's a great way of putting it.
So it's that to me, I think is, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think that for all the complexity of this, he's incredibly lucid here.
I think that's why we were drawn to this section. I mean, it's like, bang, here's a perfect example of the difference that he's trying to explicate and elucidate in the whole of the essay. Michael, I realize I read the story, but I'm going to throw it to you here. What's the mystery of this story? Tell our listeners
Of
who
Herodotus?
haven't read the essay. Like, what? So, about this story is puzzling? What about this story makes it worthy of interpretation or requiring interpretation, even though interpretation isn't exhausted? Why is this a weird story? Why is this a story that lingers? Why isn't it simply exhausted by its telling?
Well, this I think comes down to the idea of what do you do with it? What is the value
Right,
of it? I mean,
right.
when we were talking beforehand, I had mentioned, I'm like, man, I'm not sure what to do with this. Right. And
Yeah,
it's because you're, I'm trying to think of how to explain this. It's the difference between sort of what's the clear cut moral
right.
or message that you might find. I'll go back to the novel here, and something like the novel, which is going to seek to make bolder, broader, more concrete claims about the nature.
Well, I think that's a great way of saying it, but I was asking something more bare bones. I
Oh, I'm
was
sorry.
thinking, like, why is the story? No, I'm glad I asked. I'm glad you misunderstood because I like your the observation you just made is really great. But I was asking just for listeners and whatever, and people who are unfamiliar with the story. Why? What's the real on this story? I mean, what is the thing that needs to be explained?
I'm sorry, but in the Herodotus story,
Yeah, what needs to be explained?
well, I
What's
think
requiring explanation?
his behavior.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Right? And
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
question of why are you not moved
Why didn't he cry?
at his
And
son or his
this is what
daughter?
we don't, and this is why it's a mystery. This is why it requires an explanation. We would think he would cry at seeing the king, that would cry at seeing his relatives, his close relatives, the fate of his close relatives. But he sees a servant and then he breaks down. So the thing is here, we have a now the novel. What is a novel? What I mean, this is one way of thinking about the difference. What do novels do? The great tradition of the 19th and especially the early 20th century novels, they explain psychology.
We'd be told, yes.
We'd be told. I mean, like, it's all about laying bare a complex psychology or revealing how complex psychology here. Here we have the story, but there's no obvious way of reading the subjectivity behind the story. We just
Right.
have the action. So that's one of the things here is that the king is psychologically opaque. And because of that psychological opacity, the story remains a story. It's
Mhm.
never going to be suitable for novel telling, I guess, or for the narrative frame of the novel.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think it makes perfect sense. This is where we started in a way with the novel being self-contained, right? You
That's
have
it.
a definitive end, whereas with this, there's always going to
There's
be.
that's it. That's it. You hit it. You hit it.
All right.
I think we're done. I think that's all we got to give.
I'm
Well,
gonna
I
go.
mean, actually, we could talk about this endlessly, but we were trying to keep this contained
Yeah,
so that we elucidate some of the main Benjaminian themes of the storyteller. And just to reiterate our purpose again to ourselves and to everyone, we're going to take these ideas about experience, memory, time, storytelling. We're going to take them back to Byung-Chul Han in the next episode.
absolutely. All right. Well, very well done. We'll
Thank you,
talk.
Dr. Peachy. Well done on your part. I
We'll
think
talk
we're done
soon.
for the day.
All right.
Thank you, dear listeners. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.